All right, well, this is going to be a time matters project. I'm going to try to cruise through AP US history in about 30 minutes, maybe a little bit longer, we'll find out. First time period that I'm going to go through, 1491 to 1607. During this time period, you better know where the American Indian tribes are. I'm talking about the Aztecs, know where the um, Sioux are, know where the Utes are, know where the Nez Perce are, the Iroquois Confederacy, have an idea of what's going on, Seminoles, Cherokees, all that stuff. Know when the Spanish came here, you're going to have 1519, Cortez comes down to the Aztec Empire. You should be able to name, two or three Spanish empires or conquistadors that are coming in with Coronado, Balboa, what's going on with them. You should also be able to identify the mission system, the encomienda system, and what is going on with those two things during this time period. And finally, the disease and the effects that the Spanish have on the American Indians as far as creating a new race, the mestizo race, and spreading themselves throughout the American Southwest. You have the French also coming in at the same time period, and the Dutch. Dutch is going to settle primarily in what is now New York, and the French will come in through the back part of Canada down the St. Lawrence River. Next time period, 1607 to 1700. 1607, Jamestown. You're talking Chesapeake region, Powhatan Wars. First half of the people die in the first year. Half the people die in the first year. It's a joint stock company. At the beginning, they're all about profit, but then they realize, hey, we actually got to get together and run this colony well. They will defend themselves against the Powhatan Indians. You also have Pocahontas that is going to be involved in this area. If you mention Pocahontas, you got to mention John Rolfe. Then you got to mention tobacco, the bringing of indentured servants, the headright system, Bacon's Rebellion, the increase of slavery, the 40-aught. They're going to be brought by the Dutch. All these things that are going to take place just in the Chesapeake region. Then you jump up to the New England region. You got the Pilgrims coming in 1620. The Puritans coming in 1630. That brings all of, you go from William Bradford with the Pilgrims, and you got John Winthrop with the Puritans. The Puritan work ethic, all of the different things that is going to entail, along with the American Indian Wars, Pequot War, King Philip's War, 1675. All this will take place, and then you're going to have the this time period finish off with the Salem witch trials. I didn't even mention the Middle colonies. When you talk about the Middle colonies, you're talking about William Penn, Pennsylvania, the Dutch, the Quakers, and New York. So make sure that you know what's going on as far as the Middle colonies and the establishment of the colonies. Next time period you're looking at is 1700 to 1750. This is the First Great Awakening. You're going to have the influence of Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield that are going to influence this area of Massachusetts to really question what is going on in the church, and how salvation is and emotion is being brought into the church, where you actually are in control of your own salvation. Well, if you're in control of your own salvation, you can also be in control of your destiny. And so the First Great Awakening will lead to a challenging of authority along with the Enlightenment. And so this leads to the first the American Revolution that will take place in the 1770s, going into the 1780s. This time period should end with an S there in 1750s. It should go all the way up until the French and Indian War. French and Indian War beginning in 1754, Fort Necessity, Washington, the man that started the war, that brought about independence. You should know the end of the war will end in the 1760s. In Europe, it's called the 7 Years' War because it actually started in 1756. 1754, missed the Albany Plan. You could talk about that also during this time period. 1760s, here we start the decades. 1763, Proclamation Line, Mason-Dixon Line, all caused by, the Proclamation Line is going to be caused by Pontiac's Rebellion. 1764, you're going to have the Currency Act is going to be passed. 1765, Stamp Act. Also, I think in 1765 or 1764, you have the Quartering Act. Stamp Act's the most unpopular because of the no taxation without representation pitch that comes out of the Stamp Act Congress, Britain, because of the protests, because of the boycotts, Britain will actually repeal the Stamp Act in 1766. That's almost that same month they will pass the Declaratory Act, which is going to say we govern everything in the colony. So it's mom pretty much laying down the law, saying that she's in charge. 1767, you got the Townshend Acts, places all kinds of new taxes onto the colonists, which is going to upset everybody, and it leads into the 1770s where we get to bloodshed. So really the 1760s is the age of protest. 1770s is going to be the age of bloodshed, starting when 1770, Boston Massacre, Crispus Attucks. You're going to have Paul Revere making the woodcut of the Boston Massacre. 5 people die. The soldiers will be defended by John Adams, because he realizes that they're actually being railroaded, but it's a sign in Boston that there is some trouble brewing. 3 years later, you got the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Tea Party then is just going to be a culmination of events. You go 73, Boston Tea Party, 74, you're going to see the Intolerable Acts and the Coercive Acts. All of these I'm just giving to you. Hopefully you are then going to go back and define them and be able to talk about them. 74 also, you're going to get the First Continental Congress that is going to meet, and they're going to make the Declaration of Rights and Grievances. Then you have 1775, Battle of Lexington and Concord actually is a shot heard around the world, and this begins the American Revolution. You get the Second Continental Congress. They are going to try to pass the Olive Branch Petition. By that time it's too late. The Battle of Bunker Hill has already taken place, and the British they need some bloodshed because we've killed too many of them. 1776, January of that year, you're going to have Thomas Paine and Common Sense. July of that same year, you got the Declaration of Independence that brings about the natural rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so you have Jefferson, Adams, and Franklin are the major authors of that Declaration of Independence. And then finally, the reason that 1777 is so big is that's going to be the Battle of Saratoga, bringing the French into this battle. And if they don't side on the American side, we would be hopeless and probably would have lost the American Revolution. Leads to the 1780s. Treaty of Paris, 2 treaties of Paris. You got the one in 1763 and the one in 1783, ending the American Revolution. Skip forward a couple of years, 1786, Shays Rebellion, Debtors Rebellion, Farmers Rebellion. You need to know that this is actually going to lead to a rethinking of the Articles of Confederation. You should know the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, the things that go along. There's no executive branch, there's no real national judicial branch, national supremacy. So each state is its own country, and so it's very much like the European Union is today. 1787, they're going to meet and actually decide to change the Articles, but they don't just change the Articles, they scrap the Articles, go with the U.S. Constitution. It then will be, in 1788, you'll have the Federalist Papers that will convince New York to actually ratify the Constitution, and every state will ratify the Constitution. It'll be unanimous. So take Rhode Island just a little bit, but they'll finally ratify it. And in 1789 or 88, we'll elect our first president. 1789, we'll elect Washington as president. You should know, coming in that time period, that Jefferson and Adams were not at the Constitutional Convention. Jefferson's over in France representing us as a minister, and Adams is over in Great Britain representing the United States as a minister to Great Britain. 1790s, Washington's presidency, all the establishments that he creates, from creating the first bank to the Whiskey Rebellion that's going to take place. He's going to introduce the first cabinet. He's going to bring about executive power in his presidency. His farewell address is probably the most famous thing that you're going to know from the concept outline, that he warns against 3 things, which is the courts, political parties, and foreign entanglements. He surrounds himself with great leaders that are going to help him lead the country. And so that's why he's known as probably one of the greatest presidents, because he actually gives up power twice. He gives up power after the American Revolution when he could have had everything. Then he gives up power again pretty much because his second term is not going so well, and so he decides to relinquish and not run for a 3rd term. That opens the door for John Adams to be elected in 1796. He'll be elected for 1 term. Things that took place in Adams' presidency, you go from the XYZ affair, which is probably the greatest accomplishment of him keeping us out of war with France, to the Alien Sedition Acts, probably the worst thing they ever did as far as trying to extend the time period for naturalization to become from 7 years to 14 years. Then he could start arrest people that were possibly speaking out against the government, because again, at this point, we don't have judicial review. On the way out, he will end up passing the midnight appointments, but that comes as we turn into the 1800s. 1800s, one of those midnight appointments is going to be John Marshall, who later on, 3 years later, is going to introduce Marbury versus Madison in judicial review. Thomas Jefferson is elected in 1800. It's the first election that actually goes to the House of Representatives. They will have 36 different votes. Each time they will tie, and finally on the 36th vote, Hamilton, I think, convinces Delaware to abstain, allowing Jefferson to become president by one vote over Aaron Burr. That being said, Jefferson's going to drop Burr from the ticket 4 years later, but it does lead us to have a constitutional amendment to put the president and the vice president on the same ticket, which is going to be known as the 12th Amendment. 1803, largest expansion of the United States. We're going to double the size of the United States with, of course, the Louisiana Purchase. This Louisiana Purchase, in doing so, is going to violate everything Jefferson stands for. Jefferson wants to, restrain the amount of the federal power or executive power, but he just takes the Louisiana Purchase without even concerning himself with the constitutionality of it. He just knows that it's going to be good for the country. 1807, you will see the Embargo Act that will be passed by Jefferson, one of the worst things that he does, which is going to not allow us to trade with Great Britain and France, which hurts our economy and hurts the British and French economy, leading to the War of 1812. And so we finished the early 1800s as we're heading into the War of 1812. As you can see, the 1810s, there you go. War of 1812 lasted 2 years. It is really not going to solve a whole lot. The greatest thing that it's going to solve is that we are not going to have to fight the British ever again. The treaty that will end is going to be the Treaty of Ghent, signed on Christmas Eve, 1914, but we will have to have another battle that will take place in 1815, which is the Battle of New Orleans with Andrew Jackson. You should know that following the Treaty of Ghent, you'll have about a 5-year time period of Ghent nationalism. This is James Madison as president during the War of 1812. Madison will realize that we need to recharter the bank in 1816, which is part of the American system. It begins that American system in 1816. Banks, a national bank, a infrastructure that we need to build, and of course tariffs. And so he will start to realize that we need that. As we see the election of 1816 come, we start to see the last of the Virginia dynasty presidents getting elected, which is James Monroe, and he will just govern over the era of good feelings. I've always said that good feelings ends in 1820 when we get the Missouri Compromise. We're going to have the first state that's going to enter coming out of Louisiana Territory, which is Missouri. It's going to enter as a slave state. As a slave state, it is then going to throw off the balance of Congress, and so they have to balance it with a free state, which will be Maine. They will then create the 3630 line. The 3630 line, of course, is going to be the separation between slave states and free states. Any state that enters the Union above the 3630 line will be entered as a free state, and any state that enters the Union below the 3630 line will be a slave state. Well, that will last until just about the entrance of Texas and a few other states that will actually break through that 3630 line. Also in the 1820s, you're going to see the first corrupt bargain in 1824, which is the second time the election, the presidential election, actually goes to the House of Representatives, and you'll see John Quincy Adams actually get elected. It's kind of known as the end of the era of good feelings, the end of our founding fathers, and the beginning of the second generation of Americans that are going to lead our country. John Quincy Adams will leave us in 1828 with a tariff of abomination, but in 1828 we're going to get a new president, first Democrat ever, which is going to be Andrew Jackson, and of course the introduction of Jacksonian democracy, which is a very small state-run type of democracy. It is not based upon the American system because Andrew Jackson hated Henry Clay because of the corrupt bargain of 1824. 1830s is literally Jacksonian democracy. 1832, you're going to see the killing of the bank, the vetoing of the national bank. Biddle tries to recharter it early, but in doing so, Jackson will veto it and kill the bank. That's going to lead later on to the Specie Circular, which again is going to kill the economy for Martin Van Buren and the Panic of 1837, hence his nickname Martin Van Ruin. Probably the most famous thing that Jackson does that every school kid knows about is the Trail of Tears. He's going to move the Indians because he does not want a nation within a nation. And in doing so, you're going to see 16,000 American Indians are going to be moved. Of that, 4,000 are going to perish, most of them being Cherokee Indians, but a lot of them are multiple nation Indians that are being moved. You will also see in the 1830s, as stated before, the Panic of 1837, which is it's going to last for almost 3 to 4 years. It's just a horrible time for Van Buren. Van Buren, Hoover, Carter, they're all pretty much the same as getting elected in a bad timing for the economy. Jackson's foreign policy during this time period, because if you notice the 1830s, that should bring up that 1836 date, which is Texas. And of course, Jackson does not want to bring Texas into the Union because what is his fear? Fear is of course that if we bring Texas into the Union, then Mexico, we will actually have a war with Mexico. Hey, guess what happens about 9 years later? Texas enters the Union, and hey, we have a war with Mexico. So let's go ahead and enter the 1840s. In 1840, you're going to see the Whig president that is going to be elected, which is William Henry Harrison. Old Tippecanoe and Tyler too is going to be elected. Of course, he's going to be the first president to die in office, some say because of Tecumseh's curse. All those presidents that died in the 0 year or the odd year. He is going to be the first Whig. So I guess Henry Clay should have run this year, but he is going to be unable to secure the nomination. So William Henry Harrison will die. That gives us the next president, which is John Tyler. Tyler, who is a Democrat in Whig's clothing. And so the first thing he starts to do is veto all the Whig legislation that's trying to be passed by the Congress that's controlled by the Whigs. So the Whigs, what do? They kick him out of their party. And but one of the last things that Tyler will do will actually bring Texas into the Union. He will annex Texas, but it will not become formally Texas until the election of James K. Polk in 1844, and then in 1845 Texas becomes a state. So 1844 we see the election of James Polk. Polk is going to be elected to one term, accomplishes everything that he needs to accomplish in that one term, which is he will acquire in 1845 Texas. 1846 goes up and takes over the Oregon Territory, which is present-day Oregon, Idaho, and Washington. He then, of course, has the war with Mexico, which is a very unpopular war of the day, especially amongst Abraham Lincoln and Ralph Waldo Emerson. Emerson said that Mexico will poison us, and Lincoln, of course, was issued the spot resolution because he wanted to know what spot on the United States soil was bloodshed that justified this war. Well, you know what justified this war was publicity and how quickly we won the war from 1846 to 1848. We will then sign a treaty, the best treaty in the world, of course, with Mexico, which is the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And we will end up paying Mexico, I believe, $25 million. You can look it up and see if I'm right, but it's something like $25 million that we'll end up paying Mexico for the Mexican cession. That right there is going to open up the slavery question. That is going to rip off the bandage of the Missouri Compromise, and now we have to worry about slavery from this point forward. So the Mexican-American War really causes the Civil War. 1849, you're going to have the land rush, which is the gold rush. Everybody's moving west. This is Manifest Destiny at its best. Everybody's moving west and trying to claim, including slave owners, which is going to open up the idea of what are we going to do with all this newly acquired land. Leads us to the 1850s. And of course, we get the Compromise of 1850. I think in the Compromise of 1850, you should know 2 to 3 of the provisions. I'll give you 3 of them. One deals with Texas. We lose the antenna that went all the way up to Wyoming, and the federal government is going to pay off our debts. A second one could be that Washington, D.C. actually got rid of slavery. All right, I'm going to give you 4. California actually becomes a free state. California becoming a free state. And finally, the most probably controversial of the compromises of 1850 is going to be the Fugitive Slave Act. They're going to strengthen it. It was actually created in 1793, the same year that the cotton gin was created, but they're going to strengthen it and really force Northerners to return the escaped slaves. With the 1850s, you can just jump through it by twos. 1852, Uncle Tom's Cabin. 1854, Kansas-Nebraska Act opens up popular sovereignty. Little Giant, Stephen Douglas is the father of it. That's going to lead to 1856, Bleeding Kansas, John Brown, his sons going out there, Bleeding Sumner. 1858, you're going to have the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And then if you go back and cover the 2 odd years that you should know is 1857 with the Dred Scott decision. And then, of course, in 1859, you're going to have the Harper's Ferry and John Brown raid trying to actually start the Civil War. 1850s, that's it. I mean, that's going to be the decade that's going to lead right into the Civil War. You have 2 very weak presidents during the 1850s, from 1852, which is Franklin Pierce, and 1856, which is James Buchanan. Of all the presidents in the 1850s, the one that I always say you should somewhat remember is the guy that signed the Compromise of 1850, which is Millard Fillmore. Nobody remembers this guy. 1860, election of 1860, of course, who's elected? You got Abraham Lincoln, Republican, first Republican that's going to be elected. And by this time, when he is elected, the states start leaving while Buchanan is still president. So South Carolina will be the first state. And what is it? There's a total of 11 states, 7 of which are going to leave before Lincoln is elected, and then the other 4 will leave after Lincoln is elected. South Carolina is where the war will start in 1861 with the Battle of Fort Sumter. 1862, you're going to see Antietam, and Antietam is going to be somewhat of a tie, but it's not a loss. And so Lincoln's going to use the Battle of Antietam to actually decide to bring a moral cause to the war, which is going to be the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, this proclamation is not really going to free any slaves. It is a war measure. It actually frees the slaves in the states that had left the Union. The 4 border states, which is Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, will actually be able to retain their slaves under the Emancipation Proclamation. But Lincoln is going to try to give a moral cause to this war. Then, of course, in that same year, 63, you're going to have Gettysburg, the Battle of Gettysburg, and then later on the Gettysburg Address. 64, Lincoln will barely win a second term, and the reason he's going to win a second term is because of Sherman's March to the Sea. Then in 1865, the Civil War will come to an end, and most see it with the assassination of Abraham Lincoln and the succeeding Andrew Johnson becoming president. You'll see the Civil War amendments created in the 1860s, the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment. The 15th Amendment is actually in 1870 itself. 1868, you see Johnson try to pass Reconstruction, but he's going to be very unsuccessful because the radicals just won't let him. They hate what Johnson stands for. He's a Democrat. They're radical Republicans. They want to punish the South, and Johnson doesn't want them to. And so they actually end up impeaching Johnson, but they will not convict him. That leads to the 1870s, where you're going to see the election of Ulysses S. Grant, who's going to get 2 terms from 72, actually from 68 to 76. He is going to be kind of scandal-ridden. If you want a little synthesis here, you can go 1868 and 1968. 1868, you get Ulysses S. Grant elected, and then in 1968 you get Richard Nixon, and you get a little scandals with both of those presidents. There's 2 scandals that you should probably associate with Ulysses S. Grant would be the Credit Mobilier, which is a railroad scandal, and the Tweed Ring scandal. Those are the 2 scandals that I'd want you to know. Grant's going to do more for civil rights during this time period because of the military districts, and he will also passed the Force Acts, which are actually going to stop the KKK from actually growing during this time period. But you're going to see in the 70s, 1877, the end of Reconstruction, the election of Rutherford B. Hayes, the Second Krupp bargain, and you're going to see the African Americans are going to be stuck for the next 80 or 90 years in the South, stuck with black codes, stuck with Jim Crow laws, stuck with segregation, and that's what they're going to have to live with until almost the Brown case in 1954. 1880s, you see the second president of the United States that's actually going to be assassinated with James Garfield. He's going to be assassinated because of civil service reform. He wanted the people to actually have to take a test to become to work for the government, and Charles Guiteau will shoot him because of that. But Arthur, to his credit, in 1884 will pass the Pendleton Act that actually gets it, creates civil service reform, kind of ending the spoils system. 1882, Chinese Exclusion Act, immigration. Immigration goes back to the 1840s with the Irish coming over here and the Know Nothing parties being created. But by the time you get to the 1880s, you're going to start to see the Southern and Eastern Europeans coming over here with little skills, and so you're going to get more people that are going to be against the immigrants coming into the time period, or coming during the 1980s. You'll also see the Dawes Act that is going to be passed in 1887, dealing with the assimilation of the American Indians. In doing so, it leads into the end of the Indian Wars, which is literally the year 1890 with the Battle of Wounded Knee. Most of these presidents during this time period are going to be what's known as forgotten presidents, from Andrew Johnson in 1865 all the way through William McKinley in the 1890s. Congress is really going to take the control and have a very laissez-faire policy towards business, and that's why this whole time period is the Industrial Revolution, or better known as the Gilded Age, where we look good on the outside but a little corrupt on the inside with political institutions. You should know the Populist Party. You should know the settlement houses. You should have an idea of what's going on with farmers, what's going on with the robber barons as far as Carnegie, Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan. You have horizontal and vertical integration, where Carnegie is actually going to have vertical integration and Rockefeller will have horizontal integration. 1896, you'll see William Jennings Bryan will get elected, William Jennings Bryan will run for the Democratic Party. He will not get elected, but he's going to run and make the famous Cross of Gold speech, which is the anti-gold. He wants bimetallism, and luckily for William McKinley, there's going to be gold deposits that are going to be found, and so he's going to be elected in 1896. Also in 1896, you'll see Plessy versus Ferguson, that infamous case. Of the 3 Supreme Court cases that are listed on our standards, you should know Dred Scott, Plessy, and the Brown case of 1954. We round out this century going into the early 1900s with the assassination of William McKinley, but we also in 1898 can't leave without talking about the Spanish-American War. We go down to Cuba. You should know yellow journalism. You should know Guam, Philippines, Puerto Rico. You should know that Cuba becomes an independent protectorate. It is not a colony of the United States because of the Platt Amendment. Emilio Aguinaldo, that would be good. William Howard Taft was the first governor of the Philippines, treated the Filipinos very well. You're also going to get a hero coming out of the Spanish-American War, the Rough Rider, which is Theodore Roosevelt, he's going to be appointed as vice president, of course, to William McKinley, and then of course William McKinley is going to be assassinated, leading to the first modern day president, Theodore Roosevelt, the progressive president. Trust busting. You should know his square deal. You should know the 3 C's. He's going to control corporations. He's going to have consumer protection. He's going to have conservation. You should know what all 3 of those mean. You should go into Meat Inspection Act. You should go into muckrakers. You could go into the bully pulpit with the White House. How Theodore Roosevelt and his foreign policy, from the the Roosevelt corollary. You're going to have the building of the Panama Canal. You're going to have the Great White Fleet, that he is really going to build up our presence as a nation. So we're going to then become more of an imperialistic nation for a little while, but then that's going to die out with William Howard Taft, and then later on, of course, going into Woodrow Wilson. 1910s and 1912, you'll see the election of Woodrow Wilson. The only reason that he's going to be elected in 1912 is the Republicans split the vote with Taft and Roosevelt. The Wilson's first 2 years, or first term, is actually going to be governed as a progressive president. You're going to see 2 amendments to the Constitution. The 16th and 17th Amendments will be passed, which is graduated income tax and the direct election of senators. You'll see the FTC created, Federal Trade Commission. You'll see the Federal Reserve created. You will see the Underwood Tariff will actually lower tariffs, and that's why they'll have to pass the 16th Amendment to make up the lost revenue. And then, of course, the Clayton Antitrust Act, which is going to help labor unions organize. And so he has a very successful first term, but then, of course, his second term is going to be dominated by world affairs. World War I broke out in 1914. And by 1917, we're involved because of the Zimmerman telegram. We're not ready for war. We're going to have a draft to bring men into it. And so we'll send boys over to the trenches of Europe to, in a little over a year, we're going to lose 125,000 men, I think, in World War I. World War I really... the Civil War is a prototype for World War I and the gruesome nature of the war. We're going to see infringements upon our freedom of speech and the press during World War I with the Espionage and Sedition Acts, which are very much like the Alien and Sedition Acts. After both World Wars, you're going to get a Red Scare after World War I and a Red Scare after World War II, because we're afraid of the spread of communism. You should know 14-point speech, you should know League of Nations, and you should know the Treaty of Versailles, that the Senate, led by Henry Cabot Lodge, will not ratify the League of Nations, or not ratify the Treaty of Versailles, which means that we don't join the League of Nations, which means that that's going to lead us into World War II. 1920s, you're going to see the Roaring Twenties, the Harlem Renaissance. Harding, he's going to try to return to normalcy, but that is just not going to be possible. That would be better lived out in the 1950s. So the 20s and the 50s do correspond to one another. Women, of course, are going to be granted the right to vote in 1920. I did miss 2 constitutional amendments in the late 1910s, which is the 18th and 19th Amendments that are going to be passed, and that's going to be prohibition. And then finally the 19th Amendment, which passed in 1920. You get the Jazz Age, you get Lindbergh, you get Quota Acts, trying to prevent immigrants from coming into the United States. You get the Scopes Monkey Trial. You are going to have Calvin Coolidge is actually going to become president, and he's going to have a much more laissez-faire policy. Probably Herbert Hoover would have wished that Calvin Coolidge would have ran again in 1928, but to Hoover's unluckiness, he will run and win in 1929 or 28, and then in 1929, of course, the stock market crashes, which is kind of significant and shows the beginnings of the Great Depression. Great Depression, causes of the Great Depression, you're going to look at the farmers just overproducing. You're going to talk about the inability, the industrial mechanization taking people's jobs, overextended personal debts. People are going into debt during the 1920s and not going to be able to pay for it in the 1930s. You're going to see unbalanced foreign trade. The Smoot-Hawley tariff will kill us. It'll kill trade. That's why, as currently in 2016, Donald Trump talks about a increase in tariffs and stuff like that. That is never a good thing for our policy. Then we also have in the 1930s, starting in the 20s and going in the 30s, the policy of isolationism, where we're just going to watch the Japanese and we're just going to watch the Germans come to power. You have the Kellogg-Briand Pact in the 20s, you have the Neutrality Acts in the 30s, but in the 1930s you're going to have the hero that's going to come to the rescue of the Great Depression, which is FDR, elected in 1932 with his New Deal and his alphabet soup. You better know the 3 R's. You better know 3 or 4 pieces of the alphabet soup, like CCC, WPA, TVA, NRA, which is the National Recovery Administration. You should just know these and know what they deal with and what they're trying to do. You should know that he tries to increase the number of Supreme Court justices during the 1930s very unsuccessfully. And then he's going to see the beginning of the war in 1939 begin in Europe, and he will begin to say we need to start changing things. And by 1940, we're going to have the first peacetime draft. Leads us to literally his third election in 1940. First time a president's been elected to a third term, breaking Washington's tradition. But we're heading into World War II. Pearl Harbor. December 7th, 1941, you're going to see the Japanese attack us at Pearl Harbor, which is going to lead the United States kicking and screaming into World War II. 44, skip ahead, you're going to have D-Day and us trying to liberate the French, which we will do successfully at a very heavy cost. Early 1945, you have the fly racing at Iwo Jima out in the Pacific. Gosh, I'm skipping so much during this time period. I'm sorry for those of you that are World War II very knowledgeable in that time period. Conferences you should know is probably the Yalta Conference. That is going to be the last of the big three, but there's going to be major conferences that are going to discuss the creation of the United Nations. That's at Yalta. And then the Potsdam Conference, where Truman will learn, after FDR dies, Truman will learn of the atomic bomb, and he will then use it on August the 6th, 1945 on Hiroshima, and then 3 days later on Nagasaki, formally ending World War II. 46, we'll see the Berlin airlift. 48, you'll start to see the military that will be integrated. We will have black troops and white troops that will be fighting together, and that will round us right into 1950, which is the beginning of the Korean War, the Forgotten War, just like the War of 1812. 1950s, you'll see 52 is almost like the era of good feelings, because you're going to get Eisenhower that's going to get elected in 1952, and he's just going to be like a grandfather character to all of us. Even though we have civil rights going on in 50s, from 54 you got the Brown versus Board of Education. 55 you have the Montgomery bus boycott. 57 you have the Little Rock 9. And then by the time you get to 60 you have the Greensboro sit-ins, and so you have all these civil rights things that are going on, which I like to call the third or fourth Great Awakening. As soon as I say that, I jump back. I forgot to cover the social gospel movement of the late 1880s and 1890s, and the gospel of wealth and all that stuff. Can I just say how much there is? There's so much. But just put things in the right time periods. That's what this PowerPoint's for. Is just to be able to categorize and put things in the right time periods. Sputnik, space race during this time period. You're going to see in the 1950s, and the 1950s will round about with Kennedy and Nixon in 1960 running for president, and of course Kennedy will win. If you go back to the 50s, that is actually the beginning of the Vietnam War in 1954 with the fall of Dien Bien Phu in Vietnam, and then we decided to get involved. But Kennedy's major events, you're going to see the Bay of Pigs invasion, the unsuccessful Bay of Pigs invasion in 61. Also in 61, the Berlin crisis that leads to the beginning of the Berlin Wall, the building of the Berlin Wall. 62, you're going to see the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is the closest that we've ever come to actually launching on each other, us and the Soviet Union, with Kennedy and Khrushchev. After that event, we'll have détente, where we'll have the easing of tensions. Kennedy will be assassinated shortly after the I Have a Dream speech in Washington in August of 1963. 64, you're going to see Lyndon Johnson fulfill the civil rights, which comes so much better from a white Southern male than Kennedy, and so the Civil Rights Act of 1964 will be passed. Johnson will win one term. His policy that you should know is a Great Society. You should know that it's not alphabet soup. It's Medicare, it's Medicaid, it's Head Start. It's going to be the war on poverty. We're going to start welfare, the welfare system. We're going to spend trillions of dollars in this war on poverty, but in doing so, Johnson will think that he can win the war on poverty and at the same time win the war in Vietnam, because in 1964 he is going to be given all kinds of war powers with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. 65 we start sending the first ground troops, and by 68 we're at the height of the ground troops. But then we'll have the Tet Offensive that will take place. That leads Walter Cronkite to say we are not winning this war. Then Johnson says, I'm not going to run again. Then Dr. King's assassinated. Then Robert Kennedy's assassinated. Then at the Democratic National Convention, all hell breaks loose, and they're arguing between the hawks and the doves, and tear gas and beatings and all that in Chicago. And then, of course, Richard Nixon will sneak in there and get elected in November of 1968. You also have the space race during this time period. I think I kind of skipped over the Rice speech, which will take place at Rice University, getting a man to the moon and back before the decade is out, and we will do that just in the nick of time in July of 1969. 1970s. You're going to have higher inflation, higher interest rates, the beginning of stagflation in the 1970s. You're going to have Richard Nixon getting us out of the Vietnam War. He will convince the big brother China through ping pong diplomacy to actually convince the North Vietnamese to give up, and they will not surrender, but they will sign a peace accords, the 1973 peace accords. And in doing so, we would have had North Vietnam and South Vietnam, but then of course there's Watergate, and that scandal right there is going to bring down the presidency. It's going to allow Gerald Ford to become president. It's going to allow the Democrats to win the Congress back in 1974, and then in 1975 the Congress will defund the war, and so we will end up losing the war in 1975 while Gerald Ford is president. That means we will fight through 5 presidents the Vietnam War. The Gerald Ford will pardon Nixon. He's the only unelected president that we've ever had. Not a whole lot is going to be accomplished by Ford just because of the leftover feelings from Richard Nixon. 1976, you're going to see Carter is going to be elected, and Carter, like Van Buren, like Buchanan, like Cleveland in 1893, are going to be stuck with some economic panics and economic troubles of stagflation, high interest rates, high unemployment, high inflation, and he just doesn't have the solutions to the problems. Then on top of that, he has all of the problems with the foreign affairs, where you're going to have the Soviets invade Afghanistan, you're going to have the Iran hostage crisis, the unsuccessful rescuing of the Iran hostage crisis, and this crisis lasting for over 444 days. Best thing that Carter does during his presidency, of course, is going to be the Camp David Accords, which is going to be between Egypt and Israel, where Israel is going to return the Sinai Peninsula, and Egypt will promise not to invade Israel from that point forward. The hostages of Iran will be released the first day in 1981 when Ronald Reagan actually becomes president. Kind of gives us a little bit of a boost. Reagan, what do you need to know about Reagan? You should know his economic policy, which is Reaganomics, supply side economics, trickle down economics, voodoo economics. It's tax cuts, ladies and gentlemen. We are reducing the tax rate from 75% pretty much to 25%. More revenue will come in, but Congress and the President will spend even more revenue, causing deficit spending, leading to a larger national debt. Reagan sees this as a necessity as far as trying to end the Cold War, because he's going to outspend and outbuild the Soviet Union. In doing so, he bankrupts the Soviet Union. His foreign policy is going to be governed just right around trying to end the Cold War. The evil empire is Mikhail Gorbachev and the Soviet Union. Yet he will meet with Mikhail Gorbachev a lot to try and solve the problems. You could deal with Mikhail Gorbachev, but you also have the power of Great Britain through Margaret Thatcher, and the Pope John Paul II is going to also help a freedom movement throughout Europe that we're going to start to see in the mid 80s. The one scandal that does hit Reagan is going to be the Iran-Contra scandal. That scandal is going to be involve some of Reagan's subordinates that are going to, they want to fund the Contras. These are people that are fighting, freedom fighters in Nicaragua who are fighting the Sandinistas, but they can't get any funding from the Democratic Congress. So what do? Well, they illegally sell arms to Iran. In return, they take the profit from the sale of those weapons and they give it to the Contras to go fight communism. They see it as a good, because we're actually doing something good, but it's totally illegal. You can't do that. And probably the person that's most well known associated with this scandal is Ollie North, who will then end up going to jail for a little bit for his part in the Iran-Contra scandal. Reagan will end his second term in 1988 and leads us to George Herbert Walker Bush. Daddy Bush is actually going to inherit the end of the Cold War in 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall. We almost see Tiananmen, the China overturned from communism with the Tiananmen Square protest, but then it becomes a Tiananmen Square massacre. But by 1989, most Cold War is over. 91 is where you see the end of the Cold War, but most of the Cold War is over. With 91, you'll see a new war that will begin in the Middle East when Iraq invades Kuwait. George Herbert Walker Bush will put together a coalition that will actually remove Saddam Hussein from Kuwait, and in doing so, he will be seen as a hero. Not enough a hero to actually save him in 1992, because of course in 1988 he made a famous campaign slogan, "Read my lips, no new taxes." And then what does he do in 1990? He is convinced by Congress to raise taxes, the Democrats in Congress to raise taxes, and of course that is going to make him lose that election. That leads us to Bill Clinton. 1992, the election of 1992 and the election of 1912 are very similar. Three strong candidates running for the presidency. The Republicans will split the vote. Ross Perot and Herbert Walker Bush will split the vote, allowing Bill Clinton, the governor of Arkansas, to become president in 1992. Clinton's first year as president is going to be met with some trepidation, because he's going to put his wife in charge of trying to pass universal health care. That's not going to go over too well. Congress will then flip in 1994 to the Republicans, and there will be a new contract with America. Now, to Clinton's credit, Clinton is probably one of the best politicians we've had. He will actually embrace and he will take on some of the, when I say take on, he's actually going to support some of the Republican ideas like welfare reform and NAFTA and stuff like that, that he is going to help get passed through Congress. And to his credit, from 1994 to 2000, he actually is a really good president as far as getting legislation passed. Problem is he's going to have a personal problem, of course, with Monica Lewinsky, and the Republicans are going to create a little witch hunt here, both of which causes Bill Clinton and the Republicans to take their eye off the ball as far as terrorism. 93, we saw a international terrorism to try to bring down the World Trade Center. In that same year, you also have the Branch Davidians are going to be attacked at Waco. 95, you see Timothy McVeigh is going to have a domestic terrorism. But then Osama bin Laden is going to grow in power and grow in rhetoric, and he is going to talk about attacking the United States. And because we're involved in this impeachment, because we're involved in trying to remove the president, both the Republicans and the Democrats are going to cause us to turn a blind eye to this guy that is going to come back to bite us in the 2000s. Clinton will end his presidency with a little bit of a slump in the economy. I think that kind of hurts Al Gore a little bit, but it leads to one of the closest elections in U.S. history, which is the election of 2000, where the election really did come down to the state of Florida. Florida is going to have to have a recount, and they're going to recount the recount, and in doing so, it'll go all the way to the Supreme Court, and there's a Supreme Court case named Bush v. Gore that Bush will win, and the Supreme Court will tell, and a 5-4 decision will tell the state of Florida to stop counting and actually turn in their totals. In doing so, it gives George W. Bush the state of Florida, and he will become the next president in the new millennia. He thought his presidency, like Wilson's, was going to be dominated by domestic affairs, because that's what Clinton's was. So one of the first things that he actually passes and gets passed, his most successful piece of domestic legislation before 9/11, is going to be No Child Left Behind. And like it or not, all the testing and all that stuff, it comes from No Child Left Behind. But then, of course, September 11th will take place, which will change his presidency. The War on Terror. We will go to Afghanistan in November of 2001 to try to root out the Taliban, where Osama bin Laden was held up. 2003, he's going to make probably one of the worst decisions of his presidency, or most controversial decisions of his presidency, and that's going to be trying to remove Saddam Hussein from power. He will be successful, and he will remove Saddam Hussein from power, but we're not sure if the weapons of mass destruction, well, we all know that it wasn't as much. There were weapons of mass destruction there, but there was not as many as everybody had thought. Even that included Saddam Hussein, because his own people were lying to him. But in doing so, it's going to cause a power vacuum. We will stop that power vacuum from taking over in 2007 and 2008. But when Barack Obama, the first African American president, is going to be elected, he's going to be elected on the campaign slogan, "Get us out of Iraq," and he will. In 2011, he will get us out of Iraq, and in doing so, it's going to cause all kind of turmoil, leading to present-day ISIS and some of the problems that we're having in the Middle East. 2008, Barack Obama is going to face the housing crisis, and in doing so, he'll pass a stimulus package that will try to help solve the unemployment rates and stuff like that, and it will spend nearly $1 trillion trying to solve some of these housing dilemmas, but will not solve a whole lot of the problems. You will also see Barack Obama pass his most well-known acts, which is going to be the Affordable Health Care Act, or better known today as Obamacare, which is universal insurance for everybody. That is still out to see if that actually is going to succeed or not, if the private sector is actually going to accept that. He will win a second term in 2012. In 2011, he will be responsible and help to bring to justice Osama bin Laden. On May the 1st, 2011, Osama bin Laden will be killed by SEAL Team 6. Literally 4 days before the AP exam that particular year. I still remember my kids putting "we got him" on the AP exam. And this leads us right up to 2016 and the fun election that we are about to have to see who the Republicans are going to nominate, which could be Donald Trump, and see the Democrats are going to nominate Hillary Clinton, but we'll see if she is going to survive indictment from the Benghazi hearings and the email server and stuff like that. Hopefully, let's see, where am I at? I'm about 53 minutes, just under 54 minutes. So hopefully you listen to this and you're able to get some information that you should know. You can always email me at michael.yacht@leanderisd.org, and I'll try to get back to you. Have a good evening or a good morning or whenever you're listening to this tape.